Scott Moe and the Sask Party have stepped up on several occasions to combat Trudeau and his ridiculous gun laws. But does this make him a friend of hunters? Let's have a look. Welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be taking a look at something I kind of touched base on in my last video, but I figured this topic deserved its own dedicated video, so that's what we're doing today. The first couple of minutes of this will be kind of repetitive. It'll be sort of really based on what I said in my previous video. So if you've already seen that and you feel like a lot of this is just, regurgitated content, just hang in there. I promise by the end of this video, there will be quite a bit of unique stuff that I haven't discussed yet. So as you've guessed from the title of this video, I'm going to come off pretty harsh on the Saskatchewan government here. They've done something in the last couple of years regarding hunters that I think is bullshit. The word is bullshit. It's crap. It's a load of crap. But credit where it's due. They've done a lot of good work, and they've really pushed back against the federal government's overreach in a lot of areas, actually, not just regards to firearms owners and hunters and so on, but especially in that area. And credit where it's due, it's worth mentioning the good that they've done. So among other things that they've done, they were among the first of the provinces to boycott the federal buyback program. Not that they won't necessarily participate, not that they can stand against the federal government on that, but they were among the first to say that they weren't going to help them out, they weren't going to dedicate any provincial resources. Them and Alberta really were leading this charge. They were, I believe, the first to implement their own Firearms Act, which, if you've actually taken a look at that law, they troll the federal government pretty hard. I'm actually pretty proud of them for the stuff they put in there. It's great, and it'll make any kind of confiscation regime extremely difficult as a result, and that's a good win for us. And when it comes to hunting specifically, they have actually changed a few policies that I think are pretty good. For example, most people, when they think of a hunting rifle, they think of something like this Tikka back here. This is a Tikka T3X, chambered in 6.5 Creedmoor, which is great for pronghorn, great for deer, low recoil, high range round. It's great. There's nothing wrong with that. Or they think of something like this, a very typical, wooden stock hunting rifle. This is chambered in 7mm Mauser, which is a less common hunting cartridge, but it's still great, works amazingly. That's what most people think of. Or something like this. This is a Browning BLR. It is chambered in .308 Winchester, which is the most popular hunting cartridge there is. Most of the deer I've shot in my life, I've shot with this rifle. So these are normally the kinds of things people are thinking about when they think of a hunting rifle. However, that all kind of changed in 2018. Prior to 2018, the smallest caliber you could hunt with was a .24 caliber. You weren't permitted to hunt with anything smaller than that. However, in 2018, they changed that threshold from .24 caliber down to 17 caliber. Now, there are still a number of other restrictions, and I'll put them on the screen here. There are still a number of other restrictions on the type of cartridge you can use. For example, you can't hunt with rimfire, you can't hunt with a number of various handgun rounds and handgun cartridges, and the overall cartridge length has to be of a certain length. Like, there's still other restrictions rather than just caliber. But as a result, there's one big change that is probably the basis or the reason why they made this change in the first place. And the big change there is now you can hunt with .223 firearms like these. This is a firearm you can hunt with now in Saskatchewan, which I think is great. .223 is not the world's greatest hunting cartridge. It's not as good as .308 or anything like that, but it's plenty capable. It'll take a pronghorn, it'll take a deer. If you were doing something like elk or moose, I'd probably suggest something more powerful, but it's a plenty capable hunting cartridge. And provided that it's coming out of a non-restricted firearm like this, you can use it for hunting. There's no reason you can't use this for hunting in Saskatchewan anymore, which I think that's great. I would like to shoot a deer with this firearm. A lot of people are going to think that, that's overkill or that's ridiculous, especially if they don't know anything about firearms. But in actuality, that's not the case at all. So this is .308. This is what I've used out of that lever gun I showed you for most of the deer I've taken. This is actually a custom hand load. This is Nosler ballistic tips, 120 grains, I believe. They are most of the deer I've killed with this particular cartridge. This is .243. This was previously kind of more or less the smallest cartridge you could use for hunting big game. They are roughly the same size. They use the same casing, but the .243 just has a smaller bullet. I don't know how well this is showing up on camera. But now you can hunt with one of these. And I don't know how obvious that is on camera. It is noticeably smaller. Admittedly, it is quite a bit smaller. But this is still plenty capable of taking big game. So I think that's a good change. I actually kind of look forward to maybe using that firearm this fall, hopefully. Assuming, of course, it's not banned by any new OICs or by the CFAC or anything like that. There's still a lot that can happen between now and then. A lot of nonsense and a lot of crap that can and probably will happen between now and then. But that's a different topic. I've kind of already discussed that in a number of different videos on my channel. So we're going to move on. So a lot of you are going to be sitting there going, you know, this all sounds pretty good. What's the problem here? The problem is in 2019, they updated the Trespassing Act, and that changed everything. So this is taken directly from the 2022-2023 synopsis. And the synopsis is basically a big guide on hunting, angling, and trapping in Saskatchewan. And as you can see right here at the top, there was a significant change to the trespass legislation. This legislation was actually passed in 2019, but this part of it came into force as of January 1st, 2022. So let's see what it says. It says the rules for accessing land for hunting have changed. As of January 1st, 2022, it is illegal to enter any land without the consent of the owner or occupant of the land. You must obtain consent for land access prior to entry. Now, for those of you who aren't hunters, or maybe you live in a different part of the world, that might actually even sound reasonable. You're looking at that going, yeah, of course you need to get permission to go on someone else's land. It's not your land. Like that sounds very reasonable. But prior to January 1st, 2022, hunters could effectively go anywhere they wanted, provided that the land wasn't posted, provided there wasn't a no trespassing sign or no hunting sign or anything like that. Provided that you weren't given a direct order to not hunt on that land is effectively what it was. You had the sort of assumed privilege to be there, or the assumed right to be there, simply because you were hunting. And this actually applied to a fair number of other things. This wasn't just regarding hunters. The changes to the Trespassing Act, they were kind of a blanket change to rural land access for everybody out in Saskatchewan. Prior to that, not just for hunting, but if somebody wanted to go dirt biking or hiking or snowmobiling or camping or really kind of anything, you were sort of just allowed to go onto somebody else's land. There were some exceptions, but you were kind of just allowed to walk onto anybody's land, any farmer, any rural person, and you were kind of just allowed to be there unless the farmer or the rural landowner told you to, you know, get lost. Or they put up a sign that prohibited you from being there in the first place. Something along those lines, which on its surface, that does sound kind of ridiculous, but we're going to kind of look at this a little bit harder and dissect that. So this all started back in the fall of 2018. You can see here, this is taken directly from the Saskatchewan government's website. You can see here on September 13th, 2018, they released an announcement looking for public insight on potential changes to the trespassing legislation that they were looking at doing. So it says the government of Saskatchewan is reviewing trespass legislation to determine if changes are needed to better address the balance between rural landowners and the public. And it says down here, in particular, what they're looking at is should all access by members of the public to rural property require the express advance permission of the rural landowner regardless of the activity, and if so, how should permission be sought and granted? That seems like a fairly reasonable conversation to be had. The real hiccup here is regardless of activity. This really lumps every single person in Saskatchewan under the same umbrella. And for me, that really causes some problems, which we're going to dive into here. But first, I do want to point something else out. This was released on September 13th, 2018, and the deadline to submit your thoughts and opinions on the matter was required by October 1st. So this was a pretty significant change in legislation, and the government gave 2 weeks notice, effectively 2 weeks notice, a little over 2 weeks, but effectively 2 weeks notice for anyone to give their thoughts and their opinions and their objections on the matter of this proposed legislation. Now, I wasn't really big into politics back then. This was 6 years ago. I had no idea this was happening. I didn't even know they changed the legislation at all until I read it in the hunting synopsis in 2022. I had no idea this had happened until it was already completely done. Now, back then, politics, honestly, it wasn't on my radar. I wasn't looking at anything. I wasn't paying attention to the government at all. But honestly, even today, if this were to happen today with 2 weeks notice, I can't even be sure that I would notice. So for me, that's kind of scummy, but whatever. As a result, the people who probably did actually submit any sort of public opinion on the matter for the government to review, they were almost certainly the most extremely motivated people for getting this legislation passed. They were the people who have been fighting this fight for a long time, and they finally had a way in. They finally had an audience, and they finally had a voice to be heard, and they jumped on the opportunity. This wouldn't have been a fair sampling of the province as a whole, or of the general consensus of the people as a whole. This would have been a very small, very finite, very vocal minority of people who would have submitted their opinions on this matter. And spoiler alert, the government of Saskatchewan really pandered to them, or they really catered to that very specific minority. And I call them a minority for a reason I'll kind of tell you later in this video. Now, what they did by updating the trespassing legislation isn't necessarily as important to me as why they did it. I think the why really tells us a lot more about what the Saskatchewan government and what Scott Moe really thinks about hunters, more than the what does. I'm going to be going over several articles here, kind of rapid fire pretty quick, jumping between them all. I'm going to put all of these articles in the description below, so if you do want to read any of these, have a look. But I'm just going to be running through them really quickly here in order to sort of paint a picture, in order to really take a look at the reasoning behind all of the various interest groups in this, as well as the Sask Party's opinion on this. So up first, we have a story here by the CBC. It says the review, this is the review we were just talking about that was submitted by October 1st. That is this review here, the public input sought on trespassing legislation. I'm actually going to show you the review later in the video, but for now we're just going to leave it out. But that is what they're talking about. They're talking about this specific government review. And it says the review follows calls from farmers to crack down on rural crime and strengthen property rights in Saskatchewan. And that's going to be a common theme across all of these articles. The common theme in this is rural crime. People are having a problem with all of this crime that's going out on their rural properties, and they really have no recourse. And for what it's worth, I'm very sympathetic to that. Like, if we can crack down on rural crime, I am on board. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. Also says the existing law in Saskatchewan, which came into effect in 2009, makes it an offense to enter a property if the owner objects. And that's kind of what I was describing earlier. It says one way for the owner to object is to post "do not trespass" signs. So basically the way it worked until this trespassing legislation came in, you had the sort of the assumed permission unless you were explicitly told otherwise. Now this kind of flips it on its head, where you require explicit permission, otherwise it's considered trespassing. So in addition to Scott Moe, this is a guy you're going to be seeing a lot in a number of these articles. His name is Ray Orb. He is the SARM president. SARM is the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities, and he is the president of that organization. And his group has been lobbying the provincial government for a significant amount of time to really implement these changes in order to crack down on rural crime and trespassing. And again, that's going to be the common theme. It's always going to be rural crime. So it says here, Orb believes that the change will be an additional deterrent to anyone who might consider illegal hunting or vandalism on rural land. Here's another story. This one is from Saskatchewan Now, or Sask Now. These are again comments from Ray Orb, the president of SARM. And he says, we've had a lot of problem in rural Saskatchewan over the last number of years with trespassing that has led to break-in enters and thefts in terms of agricultural equipment and produce. He says, we are pleased that the province is doing the survey, and we're pleased to be part of the group that's giving answers about what needs to be done. So again, we're seeing that he's focused on crime reduction. That is the goal here. This article is from Farmers Now. I'm not going to read this whole part because there's quite a bit here, but I am going to leave it on the screen for you to read it. Pause it if you do want to read it, but we're going to pick out a couple of parts here. And in particular, I like this article because this is from Sean Diano? I don't actually know how to say his name, sorry if I'm butchering it. But he's a rural property owner, and perhaps more importantly, he's also a hunter. So he kind of gives us both perspectives in this little interview that he gives here. And I think that really sheds a better light on what's going on, as opposed to people like Ray Orb or Scott Moe, who are politicians. And they really they tend to have very linear goals in mind, and they tend to think about things by liability rather than by any sort of reasonableness. So Sean Diano had this to say. He said, I see that side of the argument where hopefully it helps control the trespassing and property theft and just unwanted people on your land. As a hunter, I can see how it's going to be quite the headache and the nuisance just trying to go about getting permissions and tracking down landowners properly. In the past, it hasn't been as easy to contact landowners to get their permission as it seems. He noted that RM maps are not as accessible as they should be. You have to pay for these maps, and at times the names on the list are outdated. So not only are the maps hard to get, you got to pay for them, but they're just not that accurate. So how exactly are you supposed to contact people in order to get permission to go on their land? For those who have never gone hunting or never actually been out in the country and tried to farmers have stuff to do during the day. They're busy. You know, they aren't just sitting around all day long, even if they're not working on their fields or tending to their cattle or whatever their particular purview is. They have things to do. They're normal people. They go to town. They go buy groceries. They're normal people. They're not NPCs waiting in their house in order for a hunter to come by to ask them if they can be on their land. So the idea that just asking for permission, as reasonable as that sounds, just asking for permission is a significantly more difficult task than you would think it would be. And if you've never actually been out hunting to do it, it's unsurprising that a politician, or that several politicians, think that this is a very reasonable thing to do. This is another story from CBC, but this time they were actually talking to Scott Moe, not to Ray Orb, and this is kind of what he had to say about it. It says, the changes aim to balance landowners' rights with people who want to access private property for legitimate recreational activities. And I want to make a special note out of this particular phrase, recreational activities. This is a term that regularly came up during this whole process regarding the trespassing legislation and the changes to it, is the idea of recreation and recreational activities. We aren't going to dive into that at the moment, but just keep that in mind. Moe then also said that the new law is not intended to affect people that are legitimately or maybe accidentally trespassing, but hopefully will cut down on the theft and vandalism. So yet again, we see, and now this is coming from Scott Moe, that he's concerned about the rural crime, the theft, and the vandalism. But hunters aren't the thieves. Hunters aren't the vandals. And this is something actually I find very reminiscent of Justin Trudeau and the Liberal stance on firearm laws and firearm policies. You see with the OICs and things like Bill C-21, we are regularly gaslit as firearm owners, saying that we could just be safe and the world would be a safer place if we could just ban all of these firearms and confiscate all these guns and go ahead with a buyback and all this stuff. And none of that ever makes any sense because we are not the problem. I'm not the problem. Confiscating my firearms has no effect on crime because I'm not a criminal. And likewise here, we see Moe mimicking the same sort of mentality, where he was worried about rural crime, and as a result, he went after hunters. That is exactly what the Liberal government does. Those are not the actions or the rhetoric of somebody who is a friend of hunters. This is taken from the Star Phoenix. So this particular story actually kind of takes it from the perspective of First Nations and treaty rights in Saskatchewan. And it says here, under the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement, the Prairie Provinces are obliged or obligated to make Crown land available to First Nations to fulfill outstanding treaty land entitlement. Very little Crown land has been made available, and most of it is in the northern part of the province. And this sort of gets us to like the crux of the problem, or the core part of this argument. Up until now, probably a lot of people are sitting here going, like, a lot of this sounds reasonable. Why do you as a hunter believe that you have the right to trespass onto somebody else's land with a firearm if somebody doesn't want you to be there? Or why should you have the assumed right to do that? And this actually kind of really points out exactly why that's important, particularly in Saskatchewan. There's going to be a number of other places in Canada, tons of places in the world, where this argument won't make sense. But in Saskatchewan, it is severely limiting to have these changes to the Trespassing Act apply to hunters. So this is taken directly from the review of the trespass legislation itself. And here, this whole article, this really goes over kind of the Saskatchewan government's sort of train of thought regarding proposed changes to this legislation. This was put out before the end of October 1st, so people were able to read this before they submitted their ideas and opinions to the government. But this does show us, independent of public input, that this is kind of where they wanted the legislation to go and kind of where their starting point was. And in this review, if we scroll down kind of right towards the bottom, they basically effectively say that the rights that they're talking about, they really just don't exist. So not only do you have a situation where Scott Moe and the provincial government is trying to reduce crime by going after hunters and firearm owners, but they're also simultaneously saying that they can do it because you don't really have any right to prevent them from doing it. Therefore, they can do it. And I don't know if you notice, but that's exactly, perfectly, what the Liberal government says about firearms owners regarding their various gun bans and C-21. They say there's a crime problem, so we have to ban and confiscate all these guns. And we go, well, that's not really fair. And they say, well, too bad, you don't have any right to them, so we can do it. That is exactly what Scott Moe and the provincial government is doing here. And as I said before, that's kind of bullshit. You know, I'm not the criminal, I'm not the thief, I'm not the vandal. Taking away my freedoms to solve that problem doesn't solve that problem at all. And for me, this is probably the most telling part of this whole review, is this particular paragraph here. It says, the impact of change. It says, we are also seeking the comments of Saskatchewan citizens on how a change to require permission prior to access would impact recreational and other legitimate activities for the members of the public with respect to rural land. For snowmobilers, ATVers, hunters, and other recreationalists, would this change represent an impediment to their activities that cannot be adequately managed? Keeping in mind that there is no legal entitlement to access private property, does making consent an express prerequisite prior to access represent an unreasonable impediment? Now, when you actually look at that, that sounds pretty reasonable, if we're being honest. I can even mostly agree with that. I think it's a very fair requirement if somebody wants to go snowmobiling on your property or hiking on your property or any other kind of recreation. I think they should have permission. It's ridiculous to think that they should just have any kind of assumed permission to just walk onto your property out in the country anywhere and just have some fun. That's nonsense. The problem with that is hunting is not recreation. Not in the slightest. It's ridiculous to even call it recreation. And for me, that really shows just an ironclad case for exactly what Scott Moe and the Sask Party thinks of hunters. They regard hunters and hunting as something as trivial as recreation, as something as casual as snowmobiling in the snow for funsies. That is not what hunting is. Sure, hunting can be fun, but that's, at its core, hunting is not that at all. That's a gross mischaracterization of what hunting actually is. And for me, that shows a level of disregard and disdain and even contempt for us hunters in Saskatchewan. Contempt that, in my opinion, is no different than what Trudeau and the Liberal government shows for firearms owners and hunters as well. And not only that, but this review either doesn't fully understand or severely downplays just how significantly detrimental this is to hunting, especially in Saskatchewan. If we go back up to the top of their review, in their very first paragraph, where again they refer to hunters as recreation, they also have this to say. It says, at the same time, over 90% of Saskatchewan prairie land in the southern area of the province is used for agricultural purposes. Over 90% of the land is used for agricultural purposes. And what that means is over 90% of the land can't be hunted on. This is going to be a bit of anecdotal evidence on my part, but I've grown up in Saskatchewan. I've been here all my life. In addition to hunting basically every year since I was 12, I've also spent a significant amount of time traveling the province for various other activities. I grew up playing hockey. I continued reffing hockey after I was done playing hockey, traveling to all sorts of small towns all over, especially northern Saskatchewan, but all over the province. I've been everywhere, and I've been there a lot. I also worked out of high school for quite a while as a rural internet installation technician. So I went everywhere in Saskatchewan, all over the place. So even though this is anecdotal evidence, I have a pretty significant sample size. And in all that time, going back really ever since I was 12, after I took my hunter safety course, I started paying attention to posted land. It's sort of a habit you develop after you go on your first hunt. You start paying attention, okay, where's the posted land, where it is, and where can you hunt, where can you can't, and all that sort of thing. You just, as a sort of passive tracker, you're watching all the fence posts and all the fields looking for postage. And I can confidently say, even though this is anecdotal evidence, I can confidently say over 90% of the land and the properties that I've driven past and encountered and even hunted on, they're not posted. Farmers and rural landowners, by and large, really do not have any problem with hunters being on their land to hunt. And yet, as a result of this legislation, basically overnight, we went from being able to hunt on effectively over 90% of the land to less than 10% of the land as a result of this legislation. That is a staggering change. That is a mind-blowing change. And the reason they made that change, as I showed you rather clearly, is they were concerned about rural crime. This has no effect on rural crime, none whatsoever. Hunters aren't the criminals. And the very slim few that are poaching or they are hunting illegally or whatever, persecute them. There are already laws in place to do that. I am entirely in favor of that. But this is bullshit. This is crap. So effectively, we went from being able to hunt on over 90% of the land to being able to hunt on a mere less than 10% of the land. Overnight, just like that. And this has very real, very significant negative impacts, in my opinion. One, makes it difficult for new people to get into hunting. You take a look at somebody like Rod Giltaca. He's the guy who runs the CCFR. You've probably heard of him. You've probably seen him. I couldn't believe it, but actually in his two recent podcasts, he openly admits he's never been hunting before. This is the guy who's leading our charge against the Liberal government for firearms rights and for hunting rights and stuff in Canada, and he's never been hunting. He's going on his first hunt in a couple of months here. He's going to go on a black bear hunt, which, no hating on the guy. I mean, you don't have to be a hunter in order to be in support of hunting, but it really feels like a guy like him should have had every opportunity to go do it, and he just hasn't. Which leads us to the second problem. When you put this kind of restraint on hunting, it leads to a commercialization of hunting. Even though it's nice that he is finally going to go hunting, he's going hunting with a guide, which is sort of like hunting with training wheels. I don't want to be dismissive of it or anything, but it really does point to the kind of change that legislation like this will make. It leads to a commercialization of hunting. When hunting becomes this restrictive and the ability to hunt becomes this restrictive, the need for pre-designated private land or specialized guides shoots through the roof. And for those of you who don't know how expensive a guide can be, I mean, even cheap guides are several $100s a day. Several $100s a day. You want to go for a week-long hunt with somebody like Jim Shockey, who's a fairly renowned Canadian hunter and guide. Most of you have probably at least heard his name before if you're into hunting. It's like $20,000 per person for like 5 days. Like it's a mind-boggling amount of money. It's a staggering amount of money. So to go on a guided tour with him on some pre-designated private land is just outside of the realm for most everyday normal folk. Before this legislation, if I wanted to go hunt a deer, I could go buy a tag for $50 and a round for $3 to $5 and go get a 200-pound animal full of meat to fill my freezer with. After this legislation, that becomes a significantly more difficult prospect. Now, for some people and even some hunters, being limited to less than 10% of the land or being limited only to certain crown land or public property or whatever, that might actually not be that much of a hindrance for them. A lot of people, that's actually what they do already. They go find themselves a nice piece of crown land or pasture or whatever. They set up a couple of trail cams throughout the year, and then come hunting season, they grab a tree stand, they go plop it on a tree, they sit above a path where they know deer come back and forth all the time, and they get there on day one and they shoot their deer. They bag it, they go home, they eat great. For people like that, this is going to be not a problem at all. This will not change how they hunt, not even a little, not one bit. This will have zero impact on them. But that's not the only way to hunt. There's a pretty significant difference between hunting off of a tree stand or hunting out of a blind, hunting at some sort of sedentary or stationary hunting like that, as opposed to truck hunting or pushing bush or anything like that. The way that I've always hunted, and I've always hunted with my dad, my grandpa, and them, is we go out and we look for our game. Not that one way is particularly better than the other or more valid than the other. They're both hunting. But my way is significantly more affected by this legislation. And I gotta be honest, if my compromise here is I have to hunt in a tree stand or a blind, for me, that's not hunting. For me, hunting is going on an adventure, getting in the truck with dad, seeing the province, going on a road trip and just driving around and meeting people, going to the little tiny diners in old rundown towns and having their most greasy, awesome burger that they have there. Like, that's awesome. And that's kind of gone now. If I'm being honest, I haven't gone hunting since this legislation came into effect. And as a result, the world gets smaller. The world feels smaller. I don't know that this will be a permanent change for me. We gotta play the cards we're dealt. I think I'm gonna try and make a point of it this year. I'm gonna suffer through and figure it out and try to find some land or some private land or something somewhere. Make some friends maybe, who knows? But I'm gonna try and get it done this year. I'm gonna try and go back out again. But for me, this has been a crippling impediment for my hunting, and I've gone hunting basically every year since I was 12 until this came into effect. So there's really nothing wrong with hunting from a tree stand or hunting from a blind. However, it does depend on what kind of animals you're hunting. If you're hunting deer, that's a perfectly valid way to go. If you're hunting something like pronghorn, that'll never work. You cannot hunt pronghorn like that. When it comes to whitetail deer or mule deer or anything like that, if you find a couple dozen acres of good territory where they like to be, they have the right terrain, the right vegetation, whatever, with enough preparation, hunting from a tree stand is very easy, and you can reasonably expect to get a deer in relatively short order, even from a stationary post. In a couple dozen acres of land, there will be deer in there. They will move around enough that eventually they will find you, and you can just get them. That's a very reasonable expectation to have, provided that you set up correctly. However, if you're hunting something like pronghorn, that'll never work. Pronghorn they're actually really fun to hunt. They're a really cool animal. But they, unlike deer who are scattered in little groups of 3 to 5 kind of all over the place, when it comes to pronghorn, there will be no pronghorn anywhere. You cannot find them, you cannot see them, you don't even know if they exist, and then suddenly there's 500 of them over there on that field, or on that hill, or whatever. And that's because pronghorn are herd animals, so they congregate in massive herds, just like sheep, because they kind of are sheep, which means you need to go out and find them. You can't just pick a spot and wait somewhere and expect that they will show up. That's not realistic. That's not an effective way to hunt that animal. Other animals like bear or other populations that have much smaller sizes than deer, things like moose, things like elk a little bit, depending on where you are, of course. But some of these animals, there are too few of them to be able to reliably expect them to show up in a certain area within a given amount of time. In order to be able to hunt them via a tree stand or via a blind or some other kind of stationary sedentary hunting on a fixed plot of land. That's just not a realistic way to hunt most animals other than deer. And then when it comes to pronghorns, if they start moving, they will run for a kilometer or two. Like they get up and they go, and the whole herd moves at once. They don't just run for 100 yards or 200 yards like a dumb mule deer will. When pronghorn go, they go. So even if you were fortunate enough to find one on crown land somewhere, if even one of them sees you and the herd starts moving, that hunt is ruined. They're just gone. They are going to run off of the crown land. They're faster than you. You can't catch them. They're just gone. So for a lot of animals, this limitation down to 10% or less than 10% of the land, you can't really hunt them anymore. It becomes a hunting impediment in and of itself. It also depends on how you hunt as well. If you are, let's say, a truck hunter, you're driving along and you see a deer 200 feet out to the side of the road. On a grid road, you can't actually hunt from a highway corridor or anything like that, but you know, a gravel road or a back road, and you see a deer basically right there, very easy shot for a competent hunter. The way it used to be, you could just jump out and harvest that animal. But now you need to actually go ask for permission. You need to be able to figure out where the person's house is on that land. You need to be able to contact them or drive there or find them or get a hold of them, negotiate with them whatever particular agreement you may or may not require in order to harvest that animal. Then you need to come back to that location and hope the deer is still there. But then there's another problem. If you shoot that deer and it runs off of that person's land onto somebody else's land before it expires or before it passes away, you then need to go find that other person and talk to them and get their permission to dress that animal and take it home with you. And what if they say no? You know, the first guy said yes, the second person's going to say no or hell no. Do you just have to leave an animal that you murdered there? Like that's a waste of, I don't know. That bugs me. If a situation like that actually happened to me, that would bug me. That would bug me a lot. I have no problems with harvesting an animal to eat them. I mean, it's circle of life and all that. But if I had to leave an animal because somebody else was too stubborn or they didn't like me or whatever the particular case might be, honestly, that would bug me. Yeah, that would bug me. All this being said, there are still going to be people out there who are of the mind that this is the farmer's land or this is the property owner's land, and you just have no right to be there, period, full stop, end of story. And if you're from a place like the United States, for example, that kind of makes sense, honestly. But here in Canada, things work a little bit differently, particularly when it comes to resources. For example, in Canada, if you're a farmer and there's a river flowing through your land and you want to use some of that water to irrigate your crops or your farm or water your cattle or whatever the deal is, you want to utilize that water resource, you actually have to go and ask the province for permission to use that water resource. That water doesn't belong to you. That resource doesn't belong to you, even though it's on your land. The same can be said, you know, if you're a farmer and you want to dig a well, you dig 100 feet down or 200 feet down. Some wells can be pretty deep depending on where you live. And instead of finding water, you find oil. How wonderful would that be? In the States, you're rich, you're set for life. You found all this oil, it's yours. In Canada, it's not. That oil is not yours. That oil belongs to the government. The resources on your land are not your resources. They belong to the government. And this also applies to deer, to the wildlife. They are a resource. If I have to ask a farmer to hunt a deer on his land that I am legally licensed to harvest, I've completed my hunter safety, I have tags for that deer in that particular zone, I'm doing everything correctly. If I have to ask him for permission to harvest that resource, to harvest that deer, it's no different than saying he owns that deer. They're tantamount to saying the same thing. And from a legal standpoint, that's not his deer. It's the province's deer. It's the government's deer. And something that always gets forgotten, especially in modern politics, is we are the government. We, the people, are the government. They are our representatives. So what that means is that the deer belong to you and me and everyone, not just that farmer. That is not his deer. We are trained and licensed to harvest that resource. The only thing getting in the way of this is his permission. So what this basically means is that for anything other than deer, the only people who can hunt are the wealthy or our landowners. And if you'll forgive me for being a little dramatic, that's not so different than the way it was back in, feudalism or medieval eras. Only the lords of the land and the kings of the realm could hunt. The peasant folk weren't allowed to hunt. That was a crime. And that's kind of what we're starting to see now with this change to legislation. Not quite. We're not there just yet. That's a little dramatic. But honestly, it's not that far off. And certainly fiefdoms and monarchies, that's a form of tyranny. That's not freedom for anybody. That's bullshit, is what that is. And interestingly enough, if we actually take a look at the Trespassing Act, the bill that they changed to cause all of these problems, it kind of agrees with me. I was actually surprised when I looked at this to research it for making this video. It's actually really short. I've been reading all these big, long, complicated Firearms Act and C-21 and all this stuff. They're dozens of pages or they're hundreds of pages long. It's very thick reading and it's very difficult to get through. This is a breezy 8 pages. So I recommend if you live in Saskatchewan, you take a look at this act. But there's 2 things I want to show you. One, if we scroll down to this page, this is effectively what they changed in 2019, is they added this section here. They did a couple of other things, but this is basically what they did. So if you take a look at that, it effectively says that you're trespassing if you enter onto a premise without permission, and the premises is one of these 6 things. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but that's effectively what it says. So it says if you trespass on a lawn, on a garden, on a yard site, on land that is under cultivation, land that is used for grazing, or other enclosed land, which is, as we discussed, that's over 90% of the land in Saskatchewan. That's basically everywhere. But if we scroll down to section 17 of this act, on the second last page, it says exemptions from this act. This was enacted in 2009 when this bill was originally formatted, and this was not removed in 2019 when they made the amendments to this act. I want you to take a look at 17 section D. It says very clearly, very point blank, this act does not apply to individuals engaged in lawful hunting. That's what it says. Now, clearly there's something I don't understand about the law because that's not the actual law, apparently, even though it says it right there in black and white. I don't know, I don't understand. But in all of the hunting synopses, in the past 2 yearly hunting synopsises, they have both said that you can't hunt without permission. The government has also made several announcements saying you can't hunt without permission. And I've even spoken to conservation officers, not as a part of preparation for this video, but just over the last couple of years. I happen to know a couple of guys. I met one at a range one time. Also, little side note, those guys that I talked to, they also think that this new trespassing provision is bullshit for hunters. But all of these sources agree that I'm not allowed to hunt without permission, but the act says that I am not in violation of that act because I'm a hunter. So there's something there I clearly don't understand, but we're going to move on. So, does Scott Moe and the Sask Party hate hunters? Well, I don't know that hate's the right word, but I do think they show disdain and contempt for hunters. In particular with regards to their categorization of hunting as recreation, as just some other form of recreation. And nothing could be further from the truth. For me and for a lot of people, hunting is sustenance. It is the ability to eat and feed yourself. For others, it's a very spiritual thing. For lots of people, it's an adventure. You go out and you see the world. In short, hunting is freedom. It is the very essence of freedom itself. And Trudeau didn't take that from me. Scott Moe did. So, I'd like to thank you all for watching. Sorry if I got a little rambly in there. I've actually been sitting in front of the camera now for over 2 hours, and I didn't realize I was quite as passionate about this as I thought I was. I had I had one piece of paper here I was going to talk with. And I went wild on this. So if you're still here, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments down below what you think about all this. Do you think we should be able to hunt kind of wherever, whenever, with some modifications? Like, I do think there's a good place for game management, for needing tags, for needing licenses, that whole thing, for regulation of hunting. Because if we didn't have that, then, I mean, all of the wildlife would be gone in 5 or 10 years. We would just harvest it all. And obviously that would be no good for anybody. So we do need some rules. But are rules like this appropriate, or are they just ridiculous? Let me know in the comment section down below, and we'll see you guys in the next video.